What's up everyone? Lance Hedrick here again, and today we're going to talk about espresso profiling. Now, 2 weeks ago I released a video called Turbo Shots, and I deconstructed a paper that discussed things that were a little enigmatic for a lot of the viewers, and so I wanted to take this moment to really give you what I think is probably the most crucial lesson in how espresso works and how espresso machines work in general. And so today we're going to be talking about espresso profiling and what exactly that means. All right, so some of the vernacular we're going to tackle today, and I'm going to try to be as articulate as possible and speak a little more slowly than normal because, as I said, I think this is a very, 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 very important topic. So words we're going to be looking at are water debit, input and output flow, pressure, which I know you know the term pressure, but we're going to look at what that really means. And we're going to look at espresso flow, all right? So what do all these things mean? Why am I bringing them up? Well, it's because there's been a long-standing understanding amongst baristas and home baristas that when you buy a certain machine, say the Breville Dual Boiler, which is quote-unquote a 9-bar machine, that people assume every shot coming out of the machine is going to be experiencing 9 bars of pressure. That's not accurate. Pressure is not an input variable. You can't just say 9 bars, I'm going to put in this coffee, it's going to hit 9 bars. That's not how that works. What you can do as an input variable is water debit, okay? So water debit is, if I were to take this, and I guess I'll just go ahead and show you. Water debit is when I take this and I put it on manual while I open the valve up. I have this Slayer modded, so I'm opening the valve up all the way for full flow. Water debit is the speed at which this water is coming out in grams per second, okay? So that's what we have at water debit, right? So I'm going to shut there. Then we have, boom, when it hits that full pressure, and boom, we're at full water debit right now. All right, so there's water debit, all right? So that is the idea of water debit, is what the machine is producing, all right? So let's put on our thinking caps to really understand this concept, because once you have these concepts down, you're going to really understand extraction a lot better. You're going to understand dialing in a lot better, and you're going to understand these charts you see from Decent Espresso Machine users where it has all those crazy lines, and you're wondering, how do those interact? Well, water debit's the first step. Again, water debit is the water that is coming from the machine unperturbed by the coffee or the basket, okay? So water debit on this machine, I get close to an 8 milliliters or grams. With water, it's 1 to 1, right? 1 gram per 1 milliliter. I get about 7 to 8 grams per second is my water debit when this is unperturbed and the needle valve is opened all the way. So that means unrestricted, the water coming out of my machine hits my scale at about 8 grams a second. Now, how do I know that? Well, I could either put a cup under there and take a 10-second chunk, see how much comes out in 10 seconds, and then divide it by 10, right, to see per second. But what I like to do instead, which I think is more accurate, is I like to take my Smart Espresso Profiler app, which I've shown in previous videos. I like to take that, and I like to connect it to a Bluetooth scale, so maybe my Akai Lunar. I like to put it underneath, and I'll just show you what I like to do. So I'm going to turn on my Akai Lunar, and I'll show you how I measure my water debit. Okay, so I'm going to do brew. I'm going to connect it to my Akai Lunar. Boom. All right, so we're going to get this up here. Let's move this. Put this in my slot. All right, I'm going to pull into this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start this as I start here. So I'm going to open my valve all the way open, and I'm going to start the shot, hit start. All right, so what it's going to happen is it's going to start reading the flow in grams per second. So as you see, the flow is going up rapidly, 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 and it's going to level out at some point. All right, there we go. So actually, when my needle valve's, oh, there it is, 8. Or, let's see. There we go. We're at 6. We're actually at 6 grams per second. That's with my valve fully open. And if I start to close the valve, it's going to start to go down. And there. Wait. I opened it up way too big. There we go. Whoops. See, and then I can see where I'm at. Going up. I'll go back down. Closing the valve even more. I'm closing the valve even more. and I'm completely cutting the valve off, so there's no flow coming out. All right? So what you can do is, and what I did, is I put little millimeter markers on my knob, and so I was able to mark what gram per second was coming out at what millimeter marker. Does that make sense? So I'm measuring the water debit at each position of the needle valve. So when the needle valve is partially closed at, let's say, 4 millimeters on the marker, my water debit is 4 grams per second, or whatever it might be, right? And this is how I like to track it. I like to wait till it's equalized, and then I'll notice what millimeter marker I'm at, and I make a note of it. And I have a notebook with all of the markings on it. So when I have a certain flow profile I want to emulate on my Breville, I will just pull it out. I'll look at which millimeter markers I need, and I will set my flow, my water debit to that. So water debit is the water coming unperturbed from the machine. Once it interacts with the resistance of a coffee puck, okay, the coffee puck is there and is giving it resistance. Once it reacts to it and pressure rises, what's going to happen is no longer is this water debit, but it's now espresso flow, okay? So you have essentially this one blanket term that I like to call input flow, and that is the water coming from the machine being input into the puck. At the beginning, since there's headspace above the puck, all right, we have our water debit coming out at whatever we set it to be. I could set it to 4 grams a second. I could set it to the full, I guess it's 6. I thought it was 8, but it's 6 grams a second. I could set it to 1 gram a second. And I know for a fact that my input flow, until pressure hits, is 1 gram or 4 grams, whatever I set it to be, per second, okay? But as that water is trickling onto the puck is absorbing the water, the head space is filling, and guess what? It goes, that's not enough flow to get through me, and it pushes back at the machine, right? And so then, whatever pressure we articulate on it, we can set the OPV, or the machine might be a set pressure. This one, you can set the overpressure valve to a certain number, and what will happen is that flow will begin to taper off until it matches the pressure that you're wanting your machine to be. Whoa, 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 that's a ton of words. Let's slow that down and go back over it, and I'm going to be repetitive, so if you want to be cheeky in the comments and say you're repetitive, bring it on. So, water debit is a known value. Input flow is known on a Decent, but it's not known necessarily on here. We can guesstimate, but it's not 100% known. So, water debit is what we are setting the water to release unperturbed outside of the group head, without a portafilter in there or without coffee in there. No basket, no coffee. Whatever it's coming out at, and that's why I use my Smart Espresso Profiler to figure out my water debit. Then, once that water interacts with the puck, it no longer will have the same value. So if we set it at 4 grams a second, just to give an idea, and we're sprinkling over a really fine puck of grounds, let's say you put it as fine as possible, well then pretty immediately that pressure is going to build. And that pressure will continue to build until it hits what your machine is just stock set at, or where you set the OPV. The OPV, that stands for overpressure valve. All the OPV does is it shunts flow. So for instance, let's say we have it at that 4 grams per second. All right, we have our machine, the water debit set to 4 grams a second, but we have a really tightly packed bed of grounds, and it's not going to allow 4 grams a second water to flow through it. Obviously, it's going to slow it down. It's going to go, yo, 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 slow your flow, right? And so what's going to happen is that water is going to try to go through at 4 grams a second. It won't be able to. The pressure is going to rise, and if we kept applying 4 grams a second, the pressure would continue to rise. But instead, with an OPV, an overpressure valve, it takes that extra water, say 3 grams a second, and says, get out of here, and it pushes it through that valve, okay? So it's like water's coming at 4 grams a second, it's hitting the puck, and then the puck says, I can't take all this, I'm going to break your machine with pressure. The OPV goes, I'm taking these, ooh, that's weird to separate. I'm taking these 3 grams, and you can take 1 gram, but I'm going to take 3 grams a second, and I'm going to discard it over here. That's essentially what the OPV is doing. Or you have a machine that doesn't have an OPV and it just is set at a certain bar and won't allow it to go over that, right? So, with this you have water debit, and then it turns into a different flow, which is espresso flow. Now, for all intents and purposes, when you're profiling shots, you can just play with the numbers of water debit, because in reality, after the pressure kind of equalizes and you have, or not as the pressure equalizes, but after the pressure peaks and begins to come down, the espresso flow, the flow coming out of the puck, and the input flow are very similar. The biggest difference is going to be the weight because what's coming onto the scale is espresso and not water. And espresso has, solids, insoluble, solubles, etc., cell wall fragments that are going to cause it to weigh more, so the grams per second will be a bit higher. But when we look at the Decent graph, which I'll show in a second, the flow and what is coming out onto the scale are very similar, okay? So when you're dialing in shots on something that doesn't have this technology, you're going to be able to replicate it quite similarly based off that understanding. So, again, let me repeat. Pressure is not an input variable. You can't just say, I want this shot at 9 bar pressure. If you don't grind fine enough, it cannot hit 9 bars of pressure. If I were to grind coffee for a V60, right? If I were to grind coffee at a 30 on this niche, if you have a niche, or if I were to grind it on a 25 on a Comandante, and I did it for a V60, and I put that in my portafilter and tamped it, and put it in here, the pressure gauge wouldn't go above maybe 3 or 4 bars. Whoops, I just started a shot. It wouldn't go above 3 or 4 bars. And that's because there isn't enough puck resistance to force the pressure to go up, right? So pressure is not an input variable. You cannot dictate pressure with your OPV or whatever it might be. That comes from the grind size and the puck resistance, right? So an easy way to understand this is water debit or input flow plus puck resistance is going to yield some sort of pressure, okay? So if you have a high resistance and a high input value, a high input flow, you're going to have quickly high pressure. If you have high resistance and low input flow, you'll have a slow increase of pressure, but it'll keep increasing until whatever you have the OPV set at or whatever it might be. So just understand that you have to use flow as your jargon and not pressure. So when you think of a Slayer style shot, when you see the people with the paddles on their Slayers, what they are doing is they are slowly building up the pressure with a low 1.4 gram per second flow rate, water debit. They're slowly saturating the puck, then they're throwing it up to a higher grams per second, and they're throwing it back down to a low grams per second. They're not pressure profiling. In a way, it's pressure profiling, but what you're really doing is flow profiling, if that makes sense, right? So all of this is based around this idea. Sorry, I got a calendar reminder. Very unprofessional of me. So this idea is related around flow and flow's meeting with resistance, okay? So what do we know? We know that water comes out at a known water debit. We know that once it hits the espresso and accumulates pressure, we have an input flow that is different from the original input flow, which is water debit. Then the input flow, I like to say it goes from input flow equals water debit to input flow equals espresso flow. So then we're relying on the flow of the espresso coming out, and that is almost equal to the input flow, okay? At that time, input flow changes. At the beginning, it's the water debit. Later, it's something different. It's your espresso flow for the most part. Remember the difference in weight, okay? So, with this knowledge, you can dial in any of the graphs you see from a Decent Espresso Machine. You can dial in on a Breville, or you can dial in on a Flair 58, or whatever, where you have a known, where you have the ability to track your flow rate, your espresso flow rate, and when you have the ability to track what's going on with your pressure. So on the Breville Dual Boiler, if I want to emulate, say, the turbo shot, which is linked right here, which is that video I did 2 weeks ago that turned a lot of y'all upside down, if I wanted to do a turbo shot, I would look at the graph on here. So I'm going to go to Settings. I'm going to pull up the graph for it. And here we go. So I have the graph right here. So we'll zoom in and look at this. So you see here, the pressure, I have it just as a pressure profile. So it comes up to 6 bars and steadies out. And so what I know on this is I need to set the flow on a certain grind size to stabilize at or below 6 bars of pressure for the whole shot using flow, right? So if I had a really coarse grind size and I used a really, really fast flow or a heavy flow, a 6 grams per second flow, I'm probably not going to get anywhere near 6 bars of pressure, right? So that's going to help me understand where I need to go with my grind size. So in reality, when we're dialing in these complex, convoluted flow profiles, we're really just dialing in the grind size to where we're wanting it. We don't need to worry about the pressure as much. We're worrying about flow, so the input flow, which starts as a known water debit and transforms into the espresso flow. And we need to understand what the max pressure should be But really, we're looking at grind size, how tightly that resistance is going to be, how tightly the grounds are going to be packed to give us the proper resistance for a certain pressure. And we need to understand the flow that's coming out of our machine. So, because we have control over pressure on something like a Flair 58, and we have control over flow like something on a Breville dual boiler, we can replicate, say, a blooming espresso shot or the Slayer espresso shot, which I'll actually replicate right now. I'll show you how to make a Slayer espresso shot on the Breville dual boiler, knowing how it goes. I'm going to replicate it with these numbers. I'm going to do roughly 1.4 grams per second for the water debit, which means at the beginning, the needle valve will be open just enough to allow water coming out at a rate, a known rate of 1.4, I keep starting this because it's touchscreen, 1.4 grams per second. Then I'm going to open the needle valve further once it starts to drip, okay? I'm going to open it so it goes up to 8 or 9 bars, okay? I'm not quite sure what that flow is going to be, but because I have this gauge here, I'm going to get it up to 8 or 9 bars. And then I'm going to bring it right back down at the end. Once I hit about 2/3 of my full shot weight, I'm going to bring it back down to 1.4 grams per second, which I know where it is on my side because I measured my water debit using this app, the Smart Espresso Profiler, link in the caption. All right, so I'm going to show you how to do this. You can do the same thing on your Flair 58, and you can do it on the Decent Espresso Machine, all because we know how to manipulate flow, and we have an understanding that pressure is not the end-all, be-all. Flow is. The flow plus grind size. That is what we're dialing in. When we dial in coffees, we're dialing in the flow profile, and we're dialing in the grind size. All right? I hope that makes sense. I'm going to go ahead and pull a shot on this. All right, let's do it. All right, so I'm going to recreate the Slayer style shot on this machine. Now, it's important to note, you have to get the grind size correctly. While I can dictate the water debit, it doesn't necessarily mean that'll be the espresso flow. Think about it. Because the OPV on this machine is set to around 9 bars, if I have it really finely ground and only do a 1 gram per second water flow, it could build all the way up to 9 bars of pressure with just 1 gram per second water flow, okay? Input flow, right? It could. And if that's the case, even if I open it up to 6 grams a second, the OPV is going to shunt the other 5 grams a second. And it will only have a 1 gram per second flow. So it's important to understand that even if you're hitting the perfect opens of the needle valve for a certain flow, you may not get the expected curve. You need to have the grind size perfect in order to replicate these shots. All right, you can replicate all day what the pressure should be. You could replicate all day what the flow should be, the water debit should be. But unless you have the grind size proper, you're not going to get that flow. So let's go ahead and do this. I have my Smart Espresso app pulled up, and I'm going to show you what that looks like on a separate camera angle. I opened up my debit to 1.4, and I'm starting the shot now. All right. So the shot's slowly beginning. That water's coming out at 1.4 grams per second. It's saturating the bed. And then the pressure's slowly going to build as that water is going through. All right, so the pressure is built. And once we get to, all right, I'm going to just go ahead and open up the valve to go all the way. All right, we're at 6 bars. All right, once I get to about 35 seconds, I'm going to go back down to about a 1.4 grams per second. All right, and there we go, back down. And done. All righty. So, there we have it. And that was too small of a cut for that big of a shot, but guess what? It's going to be delicious. So, what we have is we have this Slayer style shot where I started with a low water debit, and then as that pressure increased, I opened up the flow to really pelt through the puck. And then at the end, I lowered the water debit, I lowered the flow, I lowered it down to 1.4 grams per second because I wanted to slow the flow through the puck. Now, we have this beautiful shot of espresso. Heavy on the crema, too much for my liking, but it'll be drinking. All right, so that's the idea with all this terminology. Please let me know in the comments below if there's anything unclear. I want to ensure that I'm being as clear as possible in these because I really do believe this is the most important lesson with espresso you can have, and it's the most oft overlooked lesson in espresso. So just as my final recapitulation of this whole lesson, water debit is the initial input flow. And it's what the machine is either set to or what you set it to if you can program the flow, which most machines have the ability to be modified to do that. So water debit is what we know is the water coming out unperturbed by basket or coffee. That's the initial input flow. Once that input flow meets atmospheric pressure, it turns into espresso flow. So input flow is kind of the blanket term I use, and it starts with water debit and it turns into the espresso flow, okay? Or the flow rate. All right, and that's the espresso flow. That's after it meets pressure. And then the pressure is what is essentially the ceiling. It doesn't dictate anything except the ceiling of where flow rate can go and the ceiling of what the pressure can be in that closed system. Make sense? So pressure is not, again, it's not an input variable. It's that final bit. It's what's going to happen, okay? So it's a ceiling saying you can't, it's Gandalf, you shall not pass, right? That's what it's doing. That's literally all it's doing. And guess what? Sometimes the demon doesn't make it halfway to it because the grounds are too coarse or the ground is rockling away like in, I just made that verb up, rockling, like in Lord of the Rings, right? So, yes, so pressure is, again, like I said in the turbo shot, it's a red herring. Don't sit there and worry about pressure all day. Worry about taste, worry about flow. Worry about evenness of extraction, worry about evenness of flow through the puck. That's what really matters. That pressure, that is just, don't worry about it. Pressure is just that ceiling. Pressure is just that what we don't want the flow or the compression to get above, all right? And so that's why in that turbo shot video, I discussed 6-bar shots. That's why in that video I discussed higher flow rates. And it's because flow is what espresso is about, not pressure, flow. Now, obviously, with the lower the flow, if you get down to like 1.5 milliliters a second with 1.5 bars, I mean, if you get down to 1.5 bars of pressure, you're not going to really get crema. And I know that some of you really want that crema, so you can do a higher flow or a tighter grind or whatever you want to do. But the idea of this video is to open up your mind to what espresso profiling really is so that you can begin replicating shots you see on something like the Decent onto another machine. And so for the final thing I want to point out is I pulled up the blooming espresso profile on the Decent Espresso Machine so you can see the chart. Now, with this profile, you see that there's a blue line and a red line. The red line dictates the temperature of what's going on through the shot. The blue line is flow. This doesn't even have pressure as a preset because it doesn't matter. The flow is what you're trying to replicate. So it starts off at 4 grams a second flow. Whoops. 4 grams a second flow, then turns off completely. And then it goes back up to just over 2 grams a second flow for the rest of the shot. So the pressure is going to do what it does based off of the grind size. Again, remember the equation. The flow of the water, the input flow, plus resistance is what gives you your pressure. So stop worrying about pressure. Stop if you have your Breville machine and you're like, it's only going to 7 bars. If you enjoy the shot, that's probably a better shot anyway, because a higher flow means that it was coarser grounds, which means there was less clogging, which means you got a higher extraction yield more than likely. And go give that turbo shot of you if you hadn't seen it yet and you're curious about that. So that is the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it wasn't too much of something crazy, and I hope that the absence of too much silliness wasn't a detractor for you. I wanted to ensure I was being as articulate as possible because this is kind of complex, a complex theory to really wrap your mind around since we've been taught for so long that pressure rules all. Now, to end, I want to ask, please, 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 if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. That is the most cliche thing ever, but it always reflects in my subscriber count whenever I say it, so please like and subscribe. I still only have 68% of all views are not subscribed. So it would be great if I could convert some of you to subscribers. That would be fantastic, hitting the bell for notifications. I also have a Patreon, which I've linked in the caption. The Patreon greatly helps me with these videos. For instance, next week I'll be putting out a video on the Gaja Classic Pro and all of my little hacks on how to make it great without modifying it at all. And then I'll do another video with it with modifications. And the only reason I can do that is with my Patreon community. They told me what to buy. I use the money that they've been willingly giving me. Obviously willingly. I'm not putting them in a headlock or anything. And yeah, and I'm able to do videos like this. And then I also have a Discord that is connected to that, highly active in. Please come join us. That would be fantastic. Thanks for the support thus far, and I hope to see you in the comments below. Thank you, and cheers.